So one of the things I often notice when I'm out in nature or even just taking a walk around the neighborhood are flowers. I don't know if you've ever really looked at flowers, at the intricacy, the texture and the color and all the little pieces that go together to make a flower. But they're really amazing. They're really incredible. And I often find myself taking pictures of flowers wherever I go, trying to capture this little piece of beauty. It's almost like when God created the world, and it would have been enough to have the greens of the trees and the browns of the earth and the grays of the rocks and the blue of the sky, but it's like he looked at it and said, it's not enough. And he took all the colors of the rainbow and he just scattered them all over the place. These little tiny bursts of beauty, of color in our world. And I just think flowers are an amazing finishing touch on the work of art, of creation. And so there's this beauty to them, but there's also a sense that they don't last very long, a sense that they come and they go. They're almost more like performance art than they are like a painting or a sculpture, because you have to catch them while the show is on or you've missed it. Kind of like these flowers here at the church. If you haven't come during these few weeks of August in the summer, you would never know that we have these incredible big bushes of yellow flowers that bloom for that short season. Or if you went to my house, you would see a big green vine crawling up the front of our porch, and it would just look kind of plain. And that's because you missed it a few weeks ago when the clematis was in bloom and it was this brilliant, incredible display of purple color. So flowers are beautiful, but they're also fleeting. They're temporary. And that's one of the metaphors that Scripture uses when it compares our lives to flowers. They don't last long. Psalm 103 is an example of one of those passages. Listen to verse 15 and 16. It says, "The life of mortals is like grass. They flourish like a flower of the field. Then the wind blows over it, and it is gone, and its place remembers it no more." Kind of a cheery verse, isn't it? I don't remember walking to any of your homes and seeing that one up on your wall. It's too bad, too, because I think it would go really well over a picture of dead wildflowers. But I think we all understand what it's trying to get at. That there's this sense that just like flowers that sort of bloom for a while and then they're gone, that our lives are short. That we're not on this earth very long. And, you know, when you're in your 20s and 30s, sometimes there's a sense of being invincible, immortal. But as you get older, you begin to notice that your body's wearing out, and you begin to realize that things will come to an end. And it leads to a lot of questions, like, what is the meaning of all this? How do I know if I've lived life well? How do I find my purpose? How do I find my calling? How do I find significance in life? When we see the end coming, sometimes it can cause us to start worrying, like, have we missed our chance to make it? What's this whole thing about anyway? Well, funnily enough, there is a whole book of the Bible that's mostly dedicated to wrestling with these questions of existential angst and midlife crisis. The question of what are we here for anyway, and does any of it matter? It's called the Book of Ecclesiastes, and it's just a couple books after Psalms that we just read out of. And it's written by a guy who calls himself the teacher, who is traditionally identified as Solomon, son of David, who was one of the great kings over Israel. In fact, the scripture names him as the wisest man who ever lived. And in keeping with that, he heads out on this quest to find the meaning of life. He decides he's going to try to find where satisfaction, where fulfillment lies in this life that we live. And so he tries all kinds of different things. He tries pleasure. He lets himself do and experience anything that he wants to. wine, women, and song, partying, pleasure, luxury, everything. But he finds it meaningless. He finds it that it never satisfies him. He tries accumulating wealth. He becomes the wealthiest person his country's ever known. And it just grows and grows. But he says, you know what, it doesn't matter how much I get, it's never enough. So satisfaction is not found in money. He tries education, he tries knowledge and gaining wisdom and developing his mind, thinking maybe that's the meaning of life. But in the end, he says, you know what, smart people die the same as fools die. And so what's all that worth? He tries all these different things. He tries building projects, success, achievement, everything. And in the end, he concludes that it's meaningless. Listen to this little snippet from Ecclesiastes 2. In verse 10 he says, I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my labor, and this was the reward for all my toil. Yet, when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. So he does all these things, and his conclusion is it's all meaningless. The Hebrew word means like a mist, a vapor that just disappears. It's nothing. There's no substance to it. He finds all of life pretty much empty and futile. It's not a very cheery book to read. I wouldn't recommend reading it when you're depressed, although it has this nice honest ring of truth to it where you go, someone understands the questions I'm asking, the experiences I'm having. It's an honest book, and that's what I like about it. It exposes it brings out into the open part of human experience that I think many people have, whether you're young or old. At some point, you have this sense, what's it all worth anyway? And I'm going to just die in the end. And this sense that life is meaningless doesn't go away just because you pray or you go to church or you find God or you follow Jesus. It still plagues us. But I'm not willing to give Solomon the last word on this one. I'm not willing to just accede that life is meaningless. It's a vapor. It's empty. I don't think he was right. I want my life to count for something. I want to find significance. I don't want to blow away like a flower of the field and no one to remember me anymore. I want to leave a mark on this world, and I think that's a good and God-given desire. I think that's part of why the musical Hamilton is so popular too. Here's this man who doesn't want to waste his shot, doesn't want to give up his shot at making a mark on the world, at making a difference, at being somebody. And I think many of us can relate to that. We start life, I think we all are determined to not miss our shot. But then by the time life passes by a couple decades, we start scratching our heads and wondering if maybe we did miss our shot. Maybe we took a wrong turn at some point. Maybe we look back and we see our mistakes, we see our lazy periods, we see our regrets, and we think maybe I missed my chance to be somebody, to find significance, to discover what my life was meant to be about. And maybe now I'm just sort of stuck playing out the end like a bad movie that I started watching and I just can't tear myself away from. I don't think that's the end of the story. I think that God has something to say to us when we're worried about whether our lives count, when we're worried about finding meaning and purpose and significance in life. A couple weeks ago, I talked about how Jesus pointed to the birds and he said, look at how your Father feeds and cares for them. He's going to feed and care for you. You don't have to worry about what you're going to eat and drink. You're not going to have to worry about the necessities of life because God loves you. He cares for you and He wants to provide for you. And so you can just relax and take each day one at a time, resting in His provision. And so there's this promise in there that God provides for our needs. But what about our wants? And particularly, what about our desire to have a meaningful and fulfilled and purposeful life? Does God care about that? I was talking to someone the other day, and they were talking about when they were a teenager, they kind of had this thing worked out with their parents where their parents would provide everything they needed. Their roof over their head, food and drink, and the basic clothes they needed to wear, and even a vehicle to get to where they were going. But if there was anything beyond that, if there were any wants in life, like fashion clothes, nicer clothes, CDs, money to go out with friends, books, those sorts of things, it was up to them to find a job, to work hard, to earn money, and to be able to buy them on their own. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that's actually a very good parenting strategy. The problem was that this person had brought that into their relationship with God, and so they looked at God as someone who would provide only what was needed and nothing really beyond that. And so they could trust God when it came to their basic necessities of life, food and drink and clothing and house and the bill. So anything they could conceive of as a real need, then they could trust that God would provide for that. But if there were things that were just wants, like this idea of living a purposeful life, like the idea of finding significance or purpose, if there were things that weren't strictly classified as need, then it was really up to them to chase that down on their own and to craft their own life and to meet their own wants. They could trust God with needs, but when it came to wants, when it came to anything extra, they were on their own. See, I think a lot of us live with that idea of a stingy, utilitarian God who, yes, will meet our needs for physical survival and even for spiritual salvation, but doesn't really care much about our wants. He's eternally practical. I think it's quite possible to find ourselves in this place where we trust God with our needs, but we worry constantly about all the rest, about the purpose of our lives, about finding meaning, about finding significance. Now, it's interesting that when Jesus addressed worry in our lives, He didn't stop at food and drink and the basic necessities of life, the birds. He actually went on from there. Listen to how that passage continues after he points to the birds. He then points to the flowers, and He says, "And why do you worry about clothes? See how the flowers of the field grow. They do not labor or spin. Yet I tell you that not even Solomon, in all his splendor, was dressed like one of these. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, will He not much more clothe you, you of little faith?" So Jesus actually takes it beyond just food and drink to clothing. Now, I know you could look at that and say, well, God cares about what we eat and drink, and now He cares that we actually have clothes on our back as well, which is really good, especially if you live in Muskoka in the winter. But those clothes are probably going to be practical clothes, not the ones you wanted, but maybe second-hand clothes that are old and a bit faded and keep you warm and don't do a whole lot else, right? Because God's a practical God. He's meeting our needs for clothing. But it's funny that Jesus uses an analogy of flowers if He's trying to make that point. If He's trying to be practical, it seems like He might use the analogy of fur on an animal or bark on a tree or scales on fish or something like that to say, if that's how God keeps them warm and protects them, then he's going to keep us warm and protect us with our clothing. But he actually points to flowers, which is an unlikely analogy when it comes to clothes. And he doesn't say, look at the flowers, look how God keeps them warm in the winter, look how God protects them with their outer layers. He says, look at the flowers and look at how beautiful they are, is the implication. Look at how incredibly detailed and artistic those flowers of the field are. And so it's like he's saying, under this heading of clothing, it's like he's saying, look at the artist who painted the fields with the colors of the flowers. See, those flowers have more splendor, more beauty to them than even the greatest king in Israel, even than Solomon in all his splendor. He doesn't even compare to the beauty of these flowers. And so Jesus is saying that not that God is a practical God who's going to clothe us and keep us warm and keep us protected, but that he's an extravagant God. He goes way further than anything we could ask or wish for. And he cares not just about the utilitarian questions of life, but he cares about beauty. Now, I think it's really interesting that Jesus brings Solomon into his teaching here, because Jesus and his listeners would all have been familiar with the book of Ecclesiastes and with the idea that Solomon wrote it, and that he went on this quest to find meaning, and that he tried everything and came up empty. He found everything meaningless. And I can't help but think that maybe Jesus is doing a bit of a throwback to that book and say, hey, remember all that stuff that Solomon in all his splendor tried out, pleasure and riches and knowledge and achievement. And remember how he came up empty? Well, if you look at the flowers of the field that are just there, being what God made them to be, experiencing the beauty that he bestowed on them, if you look at them, they've found that thing that Solomon couldn't find, even with all of his achievement and splendor and riches. They, in simply being an expression of God's artistry, have found the thing that Solomon, the wisest person to ever live, missed somehow. That beauty is something that doesn't happen by our efforts, that beauty in life is something that's bestowed by God, that's a gift to be received. And so the whole questions of finding purpose and meaning in life, and the angst we feel about it, and the worry about, did I miss my shot? Did I miss my chance? Have I made too many wrong turns? Is my life redeemable? All those things are opportunities to trust God and to receive by grace, to receive as a gift the kind of beauty in our lives that we could never find on our own. You see, if it's up to you and I to craft our lives into something meaningful and significant, we're hopeless. First of all, we're not smart enough to do that. And second enough, I don't know about you, but I'm not disciplined enough to do that. I find myself constantly making the wrong choices and going the wrong way and being lazy. If we're going to find meaning and significance, it has to come from God. And so Jesus teaching about the flowers, I think, is him pointing not just to our physical clothing and the way that God provides for that, but pointing to a God who cares about beauty and invites us to trust him with that aspect of our lives. You see, flowers aren't just a symbol of how short and transient and fleeting our lives are. Flowers are also a symbol of the incredible artistry of God. And if we trust him and if we listen to his voice and we follow him as our good shepherd, we can trust that he will make something beautiful out of our lives, out of our obedience, out of our faithfulness, but also out of our wrong turns and mistakes and sins and the periods of life where we say it seems like nothing's going on, that somehow Jesus will weave all of that. God, as the great creative mind, will weave all of that together into something beautiful. Now, if it's just our job to trust him and not to craft our own lives, not to go after and seize life by the horns, what do? Do we just sit around and drink lemonade and let God just sort of magically bestow meaning on us with his magic wand? No, actually, Jesus makes it pretty clear what the next step is, or what our role is. He says in a verse that's quite famous, he says in Matthew 6:33, he says, after saying, don't worry about all this other stuff, don't worry about food and drink and clothing and meaning and chasing after all that stuff. He says in Matthew 6:33, but seek first his kingdom, the kingdom of God, and his righteousness, doing what he wants. In all these things, food, drink, clothing, meaning, significance, purpose, making a mark, leaving a legacy, all these things will be given to you as well. See, our job is to forget about our own lives and our need to find meaning and purpose, and to seek God's kingdom, his purposes, what he's doing in the world, his plans, his ideas, his work, and to join him in what he's doing. See, here's the really interesting thing is, as fleeting as our lives are and as temporary as our lives are, that's contrasted with God, who is everlasting, who endures forever. And when we join in with what he is doing, there's nothing insignificant about it. Everything he does is significant. Everything he does is important. When we shape our lives around participating in his kingdom and his purposes and his plans in the world, our lives take on eternal significance. So the next time that you're worried about the meaning of life, that you're stewing over whether you've missed your opportunity to make a mark, whether you leave a legacy, the next time you're worried you're going to miss your shot, remember the flowers and remember how Jesus pointed to them as an invitation to trust the same God that makes them beautiful to do his incredible work in your life, and to clothe you not only with physical clothes, but to clothe you with meaning and significance and purpose, and to make your life something beautiful. Don't compare the beauty that God is bestowing on you in your life with that of anyone else, your brother or sister or friends or the people around you. Every flower is uniquely beautiful. And while you might have a favorite or two, you couldn't argue objectively that a rose is more beautiful than a daisy or a carnation's more beautiful than a black-eyed Susan. Every flower has its own beauty, and every human life has its own beauty. And we don't get it by striving and struggling to squeeze beauty out of life. A flower unfolds naturally, the way that the Creator intended it to. And we need to receive the beauty in our lives as a gift from God without comparing, without worrying, simply by following his lead and doing our best to participate in the things that he's doing in the world around us. We're going to end this time by just looking at some pictures of flowers that I've taken over the years. Wild flowers, cultivated flowers, all kinds of different places. Just all these pictures of God's artistry. And as we do that, I want you to just notice them. Just look at them. See the beauty and the texture and the color and the intricacy of every petal, of every little part. And I want you to reflect on the kind of God who would have put that kind of attention into the details of his creation. What does it say about him, about his creativity, about his attention to the finest, minutest details, about his love of beauty, about his playfulness, about the other things that we can learn about him from that? And then, what are those flowers inviting us to do with our lives? How are they speaking to us about what we can trust this God, the same God that designed and made them, what we can trust him to do in our lives. And after we're done and we leave this place and you go about your life, wherever you see a flower, whether it's in front of your house or in a vase or in a painting or out in a field somewhere, I want you to remember that that flower is there as a sign for us, as a reminder that we can trust God with our lives. We can trust that the same God who gives them beauty will give our lives beauty, significance, purpose, far beyond what Solomon in all his splendor and all his searching ever found. If that's how God clothes the grass of the field that's here today and tomorrow's thrown in the fire, how much more will he clothe you and me?